Last week I spoke about five khandas, and I thought this afternoon I'll focus on the aggregate of consciousness and talk about that. It's always an interesting thing to look at. One of the big questions, one of the principal koans of spiritual exploration is what is mind? What is the nature of mind? It's something that is elusive, not because it's so exotic, but because it's so intimately close to us. It's difficult not because it's complicated, but because it's so inherently simple. It's something that we're uh, immediately with every moment of our existence, and it's difficult for us to understand its nature. The word consciousness in English is used in various ways, and sometimes, as is so often the case, it's misleading if we rely on the English word with all its baggage. As an example, I remember picking up a book once. It was an interesting book of essays about consciousness by different Western academics, psychologists, neurologists, computer scientists, and so on. It was like a collection of essays from some kind of symposium that they'd had and talking about consciousness. And you didn't have to read too much of it to realize that they didn't have an agreed definition of the word. One of the authors, for example, wanted to define consciousness as being some kind of black box. So you put an input in, sense input, then there's a black box that we don't really know what it is, consciousness, and there's an output of action. And in the course of discussion, he had to admit that by his definition, a welding robot on the assembly line at Ford would be conscious, which is an absurd conclusion. Another writer wanted to equate consciousness with self-awareness. He claimed by his definition only of the whole range of life on the planet, only humans and chimpanzees were conscious. Nothing else would classify as being conscious, which is also, I think, an absurd conclusion. And in many of the other writings and elsewhere, you often see consciousness confused with thought, cognitive thought, and it's really nothing to do with that. In the Buddhist definition, there's a clear meaning. There's two words in Pali that are usually translated as consciousness, chitta and vijnana. And some writers about this topic say that these are completely synonyms. The only difference is that chitta is used more often in the Abhidhamma and vijnana in the suttas. But I think there is a degree of difference between them. And to make a long story short, I would take the position that vijnana is chitta operating in a specific mode, in ordinary sensual mode. Then it's chitta becomes vijnana. So since chitta is in that sense the more general, universal kind of term, I'll consider that first. It's one, chitta in the context of the Abhidhamma is one of the four primary categories of reality. There are four categories of reality that are fundamental, that cannot be reduced to each other. That each one is a separate category, and those are physical matter, rupa, which in the terms of a human being is the body. Chitta and Chittasika are two components of mind. Chitta is the subjective aspect of mind, and Chittasika is the objective aspect. I've heard it defined as Chittasika is that which moves, and Chitta is that which is still. Chitta knows, and Chittasika is the known. Chittasika includes all the mental factors that are not Chitta. So it includes feelings, thoughts, perceptions, volitions, and sense impressions, and so on. These all fall within the purview of Chittasika. They're things that the mind does. And Chitta is the simple knowing. It's the witness. It's that which experiences. The key point to remember is that's all it does. Chitta makes no judgment. Chitta can neither be purified nor defiled. Everything is fodder to Chitta. It's just an object. It knows happiness and sadness, but it is neither happy nor sad. It just knows these things, experiences them, and knowing in the sense of experience, not in the sense of understanding. No? Understanding is a process of involves the cognitive faculties, and so it involves Chittasika. And the fourth category is Nibbana, the unconditioned. Each of these four is completely independent of the others. It interacts with the others, but it can't be explained or reduced to the others, is the way of understanding it. So there's a quote on which I've seen attributed to Bertrand Russell. I'm not really sure if he originated it, but I've often seen it come up with his name tag to it, is what is matter, never mind. What is mind doesn't matter. What is matter, never mind. What is mind doesn't matter. So mind and matter are two separate primordial factors, primitive factors that can't be explained in terms of each other. One kind of intellectual approach to understanding Chitta is the argument that Chitta must be non-material because Chitta is non-algorithmic. An algorithm is a mathematical term, and you can think of a computer program as a kind of an algorithm. It's something that can be reduced to a set of instructions is an algorithm. A recipe in a cookbook is an algorithm. You have a series of steps, a procedure that you carry out, so that the action carried through is algorithmic. There's no algorithm possible which can explain the simple act of knowing. If the act is non-algorithmic, it can't be reduced to a material form. And there's kind of a fashion these days to compare the mind to computer, which is kind of a fascination that human beings have with their latest gadgets. So the mind is compared to a computer. The actions of a computer carries out are entirely algorithmic. It can be nothing else. So there's a theory out there that consciousness is some kind of process that can be reduced to the physical actions of the brain, neurons firing, and somehow becomes conscious. But nobody can come even close to explaining how an algorithm could be expressed that would do that. My own feeling is that if we must have a technological metaphor for the brain, I would prefer to think of it as a radio receiver rather than a computer. It's the physical structure that interfaces with mind, and it interprets the and expresses mind into the physical realm. It doesn't produce mind. So this is Chitta, and in the Abhidhamma description of Chitta, in analyzing particular kinds of Chitta that occur, only one can occur in any given moment, but to analyze the different kinds of Chitta gets very complicated. There are altogether 189 kinds of Chitta in the Abhidhamma. And in books that have been translated into English, like the Suddhimagga and Abhidhamma Sangaha, there's a convention. They're identified by number. You see the number of the different consciousnesses, and you can make them up in the 189. You can lay them out in different kind of charts, cross-referencing them. But what is essential to break it down is there's different kind of cross-referenced categories. One of them is the kind of object that consciousness takes, and that can be reduced to 6. It either takes a visual object is eye consciousness. There's a sound object, ear consciousness, a nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness that has the sense of being touched or heat and cold and so on, the pressure or contact, what we call the sense of touch. And finally, the 6th one is mind consciousness, which knows the Chittasakas, knows objects of mind. So when mind is aware of a thought, when Chitta is aware of a thought, that's mind consciousness operating. Another way of dividing the pie is by function, and as I said, this has an ethical component that a moment of consciousness is either skillful or unskillful or functional. That's kusala, akusala, or kriya. Kusala and akusala are the terms that are used generally in ethics in Buddhism, and this is kind of like this, is that they translate as skillful and unskillful. In the mundane sense, you say someone's kusala, they're skillful. If they're a good carpenter or a good cook or whatever, then they're kusala in that regard. If they're clumsy and unskilled, then they're akusala. So actions that produce kamma, volitional actions, are classed as either kusala or akusala. And they're kusala, skillful, if they lead to a reduction in suffering for oneself and others. And they're akusala if they result in an increase in suffering for self and others. And kusala actions yield good karmic results or profitable karmic results, and akusala actions yield unprofitable karma results. And the third category there is kriya, which is functional, which is various moments of consciousness that are not intentional, they're not ethically charged, they're just the mind going through its mechanical processes. It's just aware of the sense object or so on. Oh, and there's a four. I'm sorry, I left the one out. There's a fourth category too. Is resultant vipaka, which is when you do make an action with body, speech, or mind, make kama for skillful or unskillful, then you experience later a resultant of that, which is either profitable or unprofitable. It's either pleasant or unpleasant. And this is vipaka, or resultant. And then kriya is just functional, just the processing of objects. Another way of classifying chitta is by plane, level. And there are four levels of chitta, four levels of consciousness. There's the sense sphere, there's the sphere of form, there's the sphere of the formless, and there's the unconditioned. The sphere of sense, kamavachara, is the ordinary default mode of human beings, animals, and sensual devas. This is beings that are embodied and that have various sense organs, and we relate to the world through the sense organs, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. And sense realm consciousness is primarily motivated by desire for pleasant sense objects and avoidance of unpleasant sense objects. And as I say, it's the ordinary or default mode of human beings. This is how human beings ordinarily exist. This is our kind of native native level. This is our basic existence. The realm of form is one level higher, and it is still within material. It's still attached to material form. That's what's called the realm of form, because there's still form there. But the importance of sense contact is diminished. And this realm of form relates as a practical experience in two ways. For one, in the human body, it can be experienced when the mind has very deep samadhi, and we have the enter the state known as jhana. Then the senses fall away. They're not. We're not being impinged on so strongly by the senses, and the deeper jhanas, they're entirely. And the mind is unified upon a single object, a form of some kind, either a sense of touch as in the breath, or a visual object as in kasina. And this is actually one of the explanations for the choice of the name for this plane of existence or plane of consciousness is rupa ayatana, because the rupa as a form is the form of the kasina. The other way form level consciousness is experienced is one is born into the Brahma realm, which is a level of beings that have transcended sense, they've transcended sensuality. They have no gender, so they don't have sexual attraction. They don't eat in any sense we would recognize, so they don't have hunger or desire for taste. In fact, they only have two senses of sight and hearing that are strictly functional for them. And their native, normal, basic level of consciousness is the same as the consciousness of a human being in jhana. The third level of consciousness transcends materiality altogether. And this is mind, this is the formless realm. This is mind completely divorced from the physical structure, substructure. This is mind without body. And this can be experienced also by human beings in the formless meditations, this meditation on boundless space, boundless consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception or non-perception. There are different ways to enter these meditations, which is really the only way to begin to understand this level of consciousness, is to get a glimpse of it, is to attempt to find it in meditation. It's not really easily understood just by thinking about it. One of the ways of entering this meditation, many of you will be familiar with doing metta, loving kindness meditation, and sending it out to the infinity of space. May all beings be well and happy in the 10 directions of space. So imaginatively, you're radiating loving kindness out into space in all directions. And that's a complete meditation on its own. But if you want to then take it to the formless abidings, you stop paying any attention to loving kindness and pay attention only to the boundless space. And when you're aware of boundless space, then all that exists is your consciousness filling boundless space. Then you cease to pay attention to space and you're aware of boundless consciousness. Then you cease to pay attention to consciousness and you're aware of nothingness. And then if even nothingness starts to seem too busy for you, you can cease to pay attention to that and you're aware of the most subtle form of consciousness, neither perception or non-perception. So this is that kind of consciousness, formless consciousness, as an attainment, as a meditative attainment. It also occurs as a rebirth station, that there are beings born into the realm of formless existence. And it's quite intriguing to think about them, and this can give you just thinking about what it would be like can give you an abstract idea of the nature of mind, because this is a thought experiment of removing the physical component altogether and think of pure mind without a body. One interesting aspect is that they cannot be located in space, because space is an aspect of physicality. So it's impossible to say they're here or there or nowhere or everywhere. Space is a concept that doesn't apply to them. And the fourth level or plane of consciousness is the unconditioned, is nibbana, which is outside all the others altogether. This has transcended not only sensuality and materiality, but also causality. So consciousness can exist on these different levels and planes. In each one, as you ascend through the planes of consciousness, each one is simpler, less complicated, less involved than the preceding one. So it's a movement from the complex and manifold and variable to the simpler and simpler expression of existence, until in the end the categories of existence and non-existence are meaningless. So those are the different kinds or categories of citta, and various cross-references, as I say, bring them up to 189. But basically that's it. Six senses, 4 functions, 4 levels, and this is different ways of classifying citta. Vijnana, to examine the other term, vijnana occurs primarily in the suttas, And it refers to basically the same kind of process as chitta being the subject of the knowing. So this is vijnana, but vijnana is always used in very specific circumstances, in context, certain specific contexts. It's used in the formula of the five aggregates that we talked about, the five khandha, the components of body mind of a human being, uh, body, uh, vijnana, consciousness, feelings, perceptions, and mental formations. And those last three would be subsumed in the category of Chitasika. And the five khandhas are used to describe a being in manifest existence, in this human existence, or many other kinds of existence are five khandha. The beings in the formless realm are four khandha. They don't have the khandha of body. Vijnana is also used in speaking about the six senses. They're defined as 18 components of sense. For each moment of sense, there's an organ, the eye, for example. There's a consciousness, the chaku vijnana, the eye consciousness, and there's a visible object, something that's got color and shape. It's in the light. It's a visible object. And those three, the organ, the consciousness, and the object coming together is a moment of contact. And this is an occurrence of sense experience. And the consciousnesses are defined as eye consciousness, ear consciousness, chakra vijnana, soto vijnana, and so on. And the word vijnana also occurs in the formula of the dependent origination. It takes an important spot in there. This is the explanation the Buddha gave of how this whole mass of suffering comes to be. The 12 stages, the 12 nidanas of the dependent origination. And it begins with ignorance, avijja, not knowing. And because of ignorance, formations, sankhara, which are defined as, in this context, as volitional formations. So because beings are ignorant, they do stuff. It's like you're in the dark and thrashing around, banging into stuff. It's just, sankharas are impulses of action done by beings without full understanding. And because of sankharas, because of karmic formations, there arises consciousness, vijnana. And the more extended explanation classifies this as a specific kind of consciousness, as patisandhi vijnana, which is rebirth linking consciousness. So because of the actions done by beings in the past, when the time comes to be reborn, the consciousness is determined by the sankharas, by the previous actions. And this rebirth linking consciousness is the first moment in a new existence. And if it's in a human form, the consciousness arises in the womb at the moment of conception. So it said the three elements come together: the seed of the father, the blood of the mother, and the gandhabba seeking rebirth, which is patisandha vijnana. And this consciousness then being present as one of the three factors in the beginning of a new being, the other two being components of physical form, the rupa khandha, and they carry the the genetic component, which is in the Pali system, that's a bija niyama, seed factor. That is the physical seed of the being, but it has to be energized or sparked by consciousness. That it has to arise from somewhere else. That is a being that expired or died in another form, and it arises at the moment of conception. And this consciousness being present operates together with the seed factor, the genetic component that is now in the merged cell from the egg and the sperm, and unfolds a being. A being arises according to the Vijnaniyama and the consciousness, the Vijnana. And then in the course of the life, once the being has unfolded, and part of the unfoldment of the being is the development of sense organs. This is the factor-independent origination, the salayatana, the six senses. These bases of sense functioning is vijnana operating through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. So we're back to that definition. So all these different variations, though, they all reduce back to the simple aspect of being aware, of knowing, being conscious, experiencing. This is the nature of citta. And as I said, it's so close to us, it's so intimate to our being, that we can easily forget it. And being, it's like a fish in the water. It's an analogy sometimes given. You ask a fish to describe the water, they can't, because they don't know anything else, and that's all they know. They're just in the water all the time. It's one of the ways of speaking about the practice, about the practice towards awakening, is to center yourself in the citta. There are really these in the Theravada tradition, broadly considered, there are kind of two approaches, and you also see this outside the Theravada in Zen and Tibetan and so on, but just within the Theravada you can see two broad approaches to the wisdom practice. And one is trying to be methodically, keenly aware of each object that arises. And this is the tradition that is very much strong in Burma, and is when all these various schools of Vipassana that come out of Burma, they all have different techniques, but they all talk in one way or in another about being aware of the object. This is the one way of doing it. The other approach, which you see particularly in some circles of the Thai forest tradition, very explicitly in Ajahn Mun and Ajahn Mahabua, also Ajahn Chah to a large degree, you see that the approach is to center yourself in the citta, the knowing mind, and then everything falls into place. These two approaches are they're leading to the same thing, and they essentially are two different ways of describing the same thing. Because if you're keenly aware of the objects as they arise, you are then by default centered in the knowing. If you're objectively seeing the objects and not being carried away by them, then you're sitting in the knowing mind. And if you sit in the knowing mind, if you take that as your practice, then inevitably the objects become clear. What happens when we don't practice, when the ordinary kind of confused mind in the world, is because beings get caught up with the objects and identify with the objects, and they lose their center. And you're caught up in thoughts or emotions or memories or fears, and these things are properly considered objects of consciousness. You're identified with them. So your emotion, your sadness or happiness or fear or grief or elation, excitement, whatever, you identify with that. So you feel yourself to be excited rather than to see excitement as in I am aware of excitement. Yeah? So one little small practice that actually can be quite helpful if you find yourself get caught up in things. It's just a simple kind of a word game you play on yourself, just a different way of describing the situation. If you find yourself caught up in some troubling emotional state, like anger is a good example. You find yourself getting angry and worked up. Instead of thinking, I am angry, think, there is anger. Anger or anger is arising. Objectify it right away. See it as a process, as a quality that's not intrinsic to your being. It's just something happening. Think of it as weather. You're sitting in a warm cabin looking out the window at a raging blizzard. This is a good way to look at it. And in the process of all this, don't ever forget that consciousness too is empty. It's emptiness inside, emptiness outside. It's all void. It's emptiness looking at emptiness. So and when that's understood, there's nothing to rub, and there's nothing to fear, nothing to cause distress. It's all just emptiness.